Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
The tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran have turned hot and promises to spread throughout the region. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Latest development. Tehran has accused Riyadh of bombing the Iranian embassy in Yemen, where a proxy war is being fought out in southern Arabia. Meanwhile, a number of Sunni-dominated states have joined Saudi Arabia in breaking diplomatic ties with Iran, while others have downgraded the relations with Tehran. This came after the original spark to the crisis, the Saudi execution the Shiite cleric Namir al-Namir, which then resulted in an assault on the Saudi embassy in Iran. Sort out the implications of this latest flare-up, we have by phone Muqtada Khan. He's a professor at the University of Delaware. Also in our studio, Kevin Arabi. He is American, also has Iranian ancestry, as well as has taught at Warwick Community College and the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. Welcome all to the program.
Thank you, Don.
Well, let me start with you, Muqtada. What do you make of where we are in this latest conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Even though the Iranian claims about the Saudi attack on the embassy in Yemen is a little bit stretched because the missile landed pretty far away from the actual embassy, but the fact that the Saudis have been kind of mobilizing in the sense that you have the Saudi ministers visiting Pakistan and meeting with the military generals in Pakistan. Even Erdogan has made a statement which is very clearly pro-Saudi Arabia. So this building of a coalition, of a Sunni coalition with clearly hostile attitudes towards Iran is really a very dangerous development.
Kevin, what do you make of this latest development, this latest flare-up? It seems to this Cold War, as Muqtada has suggested, seems now to be heating up. We haven't had quite direct conflicts yet, but nonetheless, it sounds like there's something really serious going on here.
I don't think it's that serious. I think it's meant to drive up oil prices. The price of oil was $100 a barrel at the height of $4 a gallon. And you have to remember that Iran and Saudi Arabia are oil countries. Most of their revenue comes from oil. So if they want to cause any prices to go up, they're doing the right thing. As far as a Cold War, I wouldn't say it's a Cold War. I would say it's an arms race. Iran has had plenty of weapons since the fall of the Shah in 1979, but they couldn't replace those weapons because of the arms sanctions that they couldn't replace them with the United States. So they've been looking to Russians for anti-aircraft missiles S-300, which is a deadly weapon. It can shoot an aircraft from 30,000 feet and not miss. Saudi Arabia has been trying to hustle very quickly to catch up to Iran or to beat it in capabilities. And that means aircraft, missiles, but it's not anywhere near ready to compare with Iran in terms of an arms race. The biggest bear in the room is Israel, actually. They have the most advanced capabilities because we've been giving them aid for years, and they get all kinds of packages from us. And what's going on is a wider regional help from the United States to provide a stalemate, like they did in 1980 to 88, is to make sure that not one country is too strong. And the way you do that is to provide weapons to different countries so that nobody can get too strong. Saudi Arabia is also trying to distract people from its internal problems, especially Iranians also. They have a lot of social issues. People don't have rights. Women just had the right to vote. In Iran, they've been doing that for a long time, more than 30 years. So in terms of social problems, this is a good way to distract the general public for what they really need to tackle is the problems at home.
Muqtada, I want to ask you, the execution of this particular cleric, why is it, do you think, that there hasn't, within the Arab world, or within the Muslim world in the Middle East there, not more condemnation of this? Is this merely a reflection of, say, the Sunni-Shiite divide? And why was it so important for the Saudis to decide to do this when obviously they had at least some indication that they would have a lot of blowback, certainly from the Iranians?
Well, at first when Sheikh Nimr was executed, it came as quite a shock to a lot of people. In fact, all the major American Muslim organizations who have in the past been funded by Saudi Arabia have actually come out and condemned him. There were lots of efforts behind the scenes to get the Saudi government to commute the sentence. But subsequently what has happened is that he had a great image as a very important Shia spokesperson, a dissident who stood up for Shia rights in Saudi Arabia. Not many people understand that Saudi Arabia has a population of anywhere between 15 to 20% 15 to 20% Shia population in Saudi Arabia. But recently what has happened is a lot of his speeches, videos have come out of Sheikh Nimr, and I posted a few of them on social media. And some of them can be actually interpreted as calling the Shia minority to arms against the state, etc. So, very clearly statements that can be interpreted as seditious. So what has happened is that the Saudis have kind of won the propaganda war on this issue. And this is not new. This goes back to even the last few days of Mubarak, where the Saudis and the Egyptians were ratcheting up an anti-Iranian rhetoric, and so this anti-Iranian sentiment, anti-Shia sentiment has been growing in the past few years. For example, if you remember when Hezbollah was fighting the Israelis, Hezbollah was one of the most important and popular organizations in the Arab world, but now Saudi sheikhs have literally transformed its image from Hezbollah, which means the party of Allah, to Hizbul Shaitan, as the party of Satan. So there has been a very anti-Shia rhetoric going on for the past 4 or 5 years in the Arab rhetorics, in the mosques, in the public sphere. Heads of states have been making these comments constantly. In some of my trips to Egypt, I have been surprised by the kind of comments that cab drivers and professors make about Iranians spending millions of dollars in Egypt to try to convert to people to Shias, etc. So what you're seeing is that there is an increase in anti-Shia rhetoric, plus there is now lots of Shia-Sunni minor conflicts taking place. You see Hezbollah operating in Iraq, and so they're in direct conflict with ISIS, which is a hyper-Sunni outfit. So you can see that this is beginning to get really hot. I'm not very sure that this has just got to do with oil prices, because Adil Jubeir gave a very long, the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia gave an extensive interview to CBS where he talks about the fact that Saudi Arabia's debt to GDP ratio is just 5 to 7. And so he's basically saying that we have a lot of room to borrow, and he's willing to borrow if he has to in a war against Iran. And Iran is in a very interesting situation because of its rapprochement with the U.S. Iran has tremendous opportunities to further reduce sanctions and get more integrated into the global society. And a conflict with Saudi Arabia could undermine that prospect, even though right now in Europe the sympathies are more with Iran than with Saudi Arabia. The U.S. continues to remain neutral at the moment. But we know that our interests are more closely tied to the Saudis than that of Iran at the moment.
Kevin, how much of this is tied to this sort of overall conflict that we seem to be seeing, in which the Iranians have sided with one group as opposed to the Saudis with another? We see that in Syria, for example. We see that even in Iraq. We've seen it in Yemen, of course. Mm-hmm. There seems to be this regional divide now, and these two major powers seem to be fighting all these little proxy wars. Is that a way to look at this?
It's a way to look at it, of course, but it doesn't explain everything. The bottom line is money. If you follow the paper trail, if you follow the trade that's going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Those two countries are not really enemies. You could say they love and hate each other, just like we do with China. We have a large amount of trade with all the countries in the region. To say that Iran is isolated ignores regional alliances, regional trade. There's a big one called ECO, Economic Cooperation Organization. They're in South Asia, Central Asia, in the Stans, and in the Middle East and beyond. So Iran is not going to lose out whether it backs one group or another. These are all, in my opinion, a way to take advantage of the Arab Spring. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries that were created after the British left the Middle East after World War II and the Ottomans fell in World War I was a way to carve up the Middle East. And what you're seeing now is the result of more than 50 years of arbitrary lines that divided people, just like what happened in Africa after decolonization. Iran is trying to take advantage of it by creating more support for Shia, so that they're trying to influence elections. Saudi Arabia is trying to go for Sunni. Iran is outnumbered in terms of Shia population. I know that's going to happen a lot. But the Arab Spring is what we need to keep in mind. A lot of these people that are young, unemployed in these countries, they want to have a better future. They don't care about Iran. They don't care about Saudi Arabia. They want to have a job. They want to have a future. And a lot of them leave. They go to Western countries to find a job. So what's going to happen? We have to look at the elections. Iran and Saudi Arabia are outside players trying to influence an internal struggle for democracy, because Saudi Arabia has been a dictatorship for a long time. There's a lot of poverty now because the oil is not as expensive as it was. It's now $33 a barrel. Iran has been a little bit more ahead. Now the numbers of hardliners are lower than the moderates. So the next election is going to be very interesting. If you look at North Africa, if you look at the Middle East, some countries have been able, Algeria, for instance, to become more democratic than others. So it's a more complex picture than just saying every single country is going to become democratic. But nobody likes change, and the most oppressive ones don't like any change. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, it's a kingdom. And they've been in power for a long time. Nobody's elected as far as the king is concerned. In Iran, they're elected, but at the same time, you have a ruthless dictator who's Khamenei, who can disqualify people at will, which would be equivalent to President Obama going to Congress and saying, well, you're not qualified, I'm going to just get rid of you. That would make him a dictator. So you don't have a system of checks and balances that we're used to in the United States. So this is a Arab people's civil society problem, and we're the outside watching in, trying to influence things in any way that we can. So we have to wait and see how the Arab Spring can come out. I think Egypt, as an example, is a tragedy because they went democratic, and then they found out the person they put in charge was very divisive. In Iraq, we had elections, then we put Maliki in power, and we found out he's a divisive figure too. So change is hard. Culture is very difficult to change, because people have been used to dictatorships for more than 50 years. So asking people to suddenly become a democratic country is a big pill to swallow. So we have to wait and see what happens in the elections, and then we can tell what's going to happen.
Mukhtar, I want to turn to Iraq for a moment, because there's sort of this interesting place where, on the one hand, you certainly have the Iranian influence, and this is a Shiite. On the other hand, you have a Sunni population. They're having to deal with ISIS and make those connections. And I noticed that the Iraqi Prime Minister al-Abadi, his reaction was cautious. I mean, he obviously condemned the execution, but at the same time, he was not certainly willing to break any kind of diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. What kind of difficulties does this rivalry produce for Iraqi leaders like the Prime Minister?
Well, see, what the U.S. invasion of Iraq really achieved was to increase, basically reverse the power hierarchy in Iraq. Iraq was a Sunni minority state, a Shia majority state dominated by minority Sunnis. And after the U.S. went and opened the system, etc., whatever we did there, the Shias have basically taken power in Iraq. At least they control Baghdad and a lot of the oil money. what that did was to increase Iran's influence in Iraq. Until then, Iraq and Iran were rivals, having fought a massive war that lasted for nearly 8 years. But suddenly, Iran had more influence in Iraq. So, in that sense, one of the talk, for example, if you followed the arguments that Professor Walid Nasser of Johns Hopkins was making about the rise of the Shia power in the region, you found an arc of Shia power from Lebanon to Iraq to Iran. So it's like an arc of Shia, and if you notice what is at the center is Saudi Arabia. So if you're looking at the northeast, northwest, north of Saudi Arabia, and if you're looking at it from geopolitical sense, you're looking at you suddenly feel as if you're being surrounded by a Shia nexus, Hezbollah, Iraq, and Iran. So in that sense, with the rise of Iran's influence in the Middle East and its ability to perhaps come out of the sanctions that the West has imposed, it has made Saudi Arabia very nervous. It's not just the rise of Iran, but also with all the destabilization of former Saudi allies as a result of the Arab Spring. Saudi Arabia feels as if the traditional order in the Middle East, which provided stability for all these years and allowed oil-rich countries to basically enjoy their wealth and develop their countries using oil wealth, is being completely destabilized. Saudi Arabia is pumping billions of dollars in Egypt to stabilize it. They're fighting a war in Yemen to ensure that the Shias, the Iranian-backed Houthis, do not take over Yemen. And Saudis are also in some way committed to security in Iraq because they are part of the coalition against ISIS. So if you see, suddenly Saudi Arabia, which used to be in foreign policy economically globalized but militarily isolationist, is now exerting military power, diplomatic power in the region far more than it has ever done in the past. It's actually engaged in war right now. So the Saudis feel that it's very dangerous. In fact, to a question from, I think, the Economist as to whether the Saudis can afford to fight these wars, the Saudi foreign minister responded by saying that foreign policy is not a hobby, it's a necessity. So Saudi Arabia feels that in order to protect the regime, to protect Saudi interests, it has to engage. It's engaged in Bahrain also militarily, sent troops there during the Arab Spring. So the Saudis feel quite threatened, both externally and internally. There is a lot of instability in Saudi Arabia, not just from the fact that the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia is kind of getting agitated, but even others are demanding more rights a la the Arab Spring. So the Saudis feel that the regime is weaker at home and is threatened internationally, and therefore it is feeling the exact. But we must also remember that in the long run, that the United States and Great Britain, and to some extent even France, their economic interests are very intimately tied with Saudi Arabia. So if things get really tough, Saudi Arabia not only will be able to rely on the Sunni coalition that is building for military purposes, but it will also be able to rely on the United States and Great Britain to a great extent if there is hostility with Iran, will become far more serious. So in that sense, it is not in the interest of Iran to allow these things to escalate to the point where the U.S. and Western countries will be forced to take active role in the conflict as well as choose sides.
Kevin, where does this lead, do you think, the United States? Because, as a matter of fact, I was reading earlier this week that one of the observations was that we obviously have a nuclear deal with the Iranians. And in one sense, it makes it a little more difficult because we are relying upon the Iranians to go ahead and commit themselves to carry out this deal. On the other hand, we have this conflict that is going on. What role do you see the United States, or is it just between behind the eight ball when it comes to being able to deal with this?
Well, I first wanted.
Hang on a second. Hang on just a second. Kevin, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to thank our troops, the men and women that sacrifice their lives and put their lives on the line for our country every single day since 2001. to bring more freedom and justice for our friends and brothers in the Middle East. We are winning. It's a very small victory that we're winning, but we are getting somewhere after more than 10 years of struggle. The first victory we've had is the Iraqi army. If you heard, they were able to recapture Ramadi from ISIS. And the biggest threat to us is terrorism, because we don't know when is the next attack. We are going to be needed over there, but financially we're going to have to withdraw as much as we can without totally withdrawing. So what does that mean? It means that we have a $18 trillion deficit. We're going to have to pay that back. China, Japan, and many other countries are our creditors. We are watching this from Obama's eyes. He has one more year left. He wants a legacy. The nuclear deal was a victory for Iran and us in terms of releasing funds for the Iranian regime, because the sanctions really hurt Iran badly. Their currency plummeted, their revenue plummeted, the economic situation in Iran is very bad. Even the hospitals are struggling to provide treatment. So what we're saying is that we're going to withdraw a little bit, but we're diverting a lot of our resources again back to Afghanistan. What we don't want to do, excuse me, is to have an indefinite presence of the United States in that region with troops and military presence, because we don't have the money. What's going to happen, what's going to look like is the United States will withdraw, and we're going to see more Arabs involved in their own problems. We have to stop rescuing everybody every single day. We have to withdraw a little bit and let Arabs take care of their own problems, train them, advise them on how to defend their own countries. This problem with Iran and Saudi Arabia is just one blip in a larger conflict that's been going on for a long time. Saudi Arabia and Iran do not have an interest in destroying one another, because they do trade with one another. And during the Shah's regime, they were considered the two pillars of the Middle East. After the Shah fell, you saw a diversity of portfolio of who we could go to. Egypt was one, Israel became one, and Saudi Arabia became one. It is true that Saudi Arabia is trying to resist change because they're the most oppressive one in the Middle East. But in terms of what we're going to do after Obama leaves office and another president gets in, we cannot afford to become more aggressive. If you look at our history, our United States, all the way back to 100, 200 years ago, every time we have a issue where people are sick of war or there's a financial issue, with withdrawal, we become isolationist a little bit, because it's very costly. We have military stations all over the world, and we are becoming a little unpopular, because in Japan, if you saw, we moved the base from Okinawa. In Germany, I think we're going to probably see some resistance to our bases over there, because none of these countries really want a military presence in their country. And we've diverted a lot of our resources, if we've been watching, out of the Middle East to Asia, because China is deliberately trying to agitate and claim some of those territories that it doesn't belong to it. So the last thing I wanted to add is we are also watching China, because China is very dependent on Middle Eastern oil. They're the largest Middle Eastern oil consumer. We're the second largest. So I think we're going to have to let other people chip in a little bit to the bill of securing the Middle East.
Mukhtar, what about the idea? What are the options for the United States in this conflict? Where does it put the U.S.?
Well, there are two things to remember. One is that, as your other guest has already pointed out, Obama's foreign policy legacy is now in the hands of the Iranians. The Iranians, if they come through and Obama is able to open the U.S. embassy in Tehran a few days before he walks away into the sunset, it'll be an incredible legacy. Obamacare on domestic issues and peace with Cuba and Iran would be a feather in his cap. So in that sense, to some extent, the United States is going to try and make sure that it doesn't rock the boat. The other part is that if this conflict increases the price of oil and takes it back up to $50, $60 or more, then it actually does not serve the Middle Eastern oil producers' interest, because the fracking industry in North America will again begin to profit. The companies that use fracking as a technology cannot survive if the oil prices are below $50 a barrel. They do well if it is above. So in that sense, even if the prices go up, it's not bad for the U.S. economy, but it could hurt the global economy. But an all-out war between Iran and Saudi Arabia involving Pakistan and Turkey is really the worst possible scenario in the Middle East. And even a Cold War, if Iran starts instigating the Saudi Shias to commit acts of terrorism inside Saudi Arabia, and if the Houthis start crossing the border and try to operate inside Saudi Arabia, this is going to completely destabilize the region. Because while, as you can see, even just Iraq and Syria's destabilization is having such a huge impact on Europe through immigration and refugee status. But a conflict that involves Saudi Arabia, which houses both Mecca and Medina, two of the most holiest of Muslim sites, it will really make the entire Muslim population in the world very, very nervous. I can assure you that. And so even if countries like Pakistan in particular and Egypt, etc., if the governments may not want it, their populations will be really motivated to get involved to protect. And a hot war in which Iran is shooting missiles potentially at Saudi Arabia, and if anything comes close to Mecca, it is going to really explode. So in that sense, it's in nobody's interest to allow this conflict to escalate. What is probably going to happen is that the United States is going to try and work behind the scenes to force the Saudis to exercise more restraint and basically tell the Iranians to back off. It is, after all, an internal affairs. And in the last 3 years, you must remember the Iranians have executed more people at home than the Saudis have done. I mean, these 3 or 4 entities, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and ISIS, seem to be competing on how many people they will execute in a year, which is all of them are close to 100 and more, and Iran executes more people, and many of them are Sunnis, and all of that is now being developed. So this, in the long run for Iran, which is just the only one major Shia country in the world, the Shia population in the Muslim world is about 15%. So the odds are not in the favor of Iran to actually have a major conflict. What it can do is to become a source of irritant and get concessions from other parts of the world. But this is not in the interest of the Iranians in terms of military or economic interest. But the problem is that the mixing of religion and politics really intensifies this. And if you remember that this is not the only cleric, just a year and a half ago, a very prominent Shia cleric in Egypt was literally dragged from his house and publicly lynched. That video is available on YouTube. Yes, there is a lot of feeling among the Shias that they are being oppressed by Sunnis. In Pakistan, Shia professionals, doctors, and scholars are frequently targeted and killed. So there is clearly a perception among the Shias that they are being oppressed by the Sunnis wherever they are in a minority. And so they are at the moment angry, but hopefully this anger will dissipate and more sensible politics will prevail in the region.
Finally, Kevin, one final thought to you. How much of this is, particularly this kind of conflict, is due to the kind of, for lack of a better word, extremist ideologies that have grown out of the Islamic world there?
Theologically, the Saudis are very close to what ISIS believes in, the Wahhabi Salafi ideology, in which they are very eager to brand even Muslims as non-Muslims and exercise violence, etc., against. But having said that, we have seen that the same ideology, same theology, it manifests in such an ugly and brutal fashion by ISIS. But Saudi Arabia, in terms of foreign policy, has been very quietist for over the decades, has been one of the United States' best allies. With the same theology, its foreign policy has never been extremist. It has not supported terrorism in the way other countries have supported terrorism, even though 15 of the 19 attackers on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia as a state has never gone into sponsoring terrorism or supporting it in that way. So while these extremist ideas are there, they don't necessarily translate into foreign policy. Even Kuwait and Qatar and United Arab Emirates all share the same theology of ISIS, but it has not had the same impact. But the fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia's geopolitics are also exacerbating the Shia-Sunni partisan feeling, which go back to about 1,200 years, 1,300 years, definitely contributes to making the conflict a bit more irrational, a bit more complicated. If it was not a Shia-Sunni issue, then it would have been far more easy to resolve these issues through material means. I think it's not in interest or in your territorial interest to have this conflict. But there will be hardliners on both sides who really don't care about the cost or the long-term implications. They just hate the other side. And there is an element in both sides among Shias and Sunnis who hate each other. In the United States, American Muslims have really worked very hard for the last 4 or 5 years to ensure that there is no anti-Shia, anti-Sunni sentiments here in the country. The leaders have worked together to have various declarations of cooperation and mutual respect, etc. But in other parts, like England, for example, there is a lot of anti-Shia rhetoric and anti-Sunni rhetoric among Muslims there. So it is clear that the religious partisanship does make the conflict a bit more difficult to resolve than if it was without those religious differences.
Kevin, final word about that idea that conflict over this ideology that seems to have gotten out there, and both Iran and the Saudis seem to have bought into this strain that sometimes I don't think they can control.
ISIS is a result of Iraq falling apart. ISIS didn't come out of nowhere. In the last 10 years, there was been an extensive intelligence on where ISIS came from. Neither country likes ISIS. Nobody wants ISIS in the Middle East. ISIS is the result of a power vacuum in Iraq. When you put a dictator, Saddam Hussein came to power without elections. He murdered his opponents. He's had a terrible history with how he was raised. And he was a Ba'ath Party. Either he was a Sunni. The Ba'ath Party is a very brutal dictatorship that he created. He murdered his own people. He gassed his own people against UN conventions. So the story is very long with Iraq. After we deposed him in 2003, which was the right thing to do, the Kurds lobbied for us to get involved in Iraq. A lot of people don't know that. So it's good that he went. It's good that they finally, publicly executed him. Although executions are a little barbaric, that's what people wanted from the trial. You have a lot of unemployed people in the Middle East, 50% or more, who are educated. Some are not educated. Some have not had relationships with a woman. This is a social issue. So what happens is they gravitate towards something that gives them a sense of identity and purpose in life. And so what you've seen is you've seen a large number of disgruntled, unemployed young men getting recruited to a radical ideology because they don't know any better. And in this power vacuum where Iraq doesn't seem to have, although right now it does a little bit more, a central government, you're saying that they're losing. France symbolically attacked ISIS right away after the Paris attacks. You've seen that Saudi Arabia is also becoming very reactive. Neither power, France or Saudi Arabia, is used to being militarily involved. So whenever they have a reaction, they have a very quick reaction. Iran is more measured because they've been military for as long as you can remember. So I think ISIS is a biggest threat to us and to the power of others because they have funding, they have military, they have logistics, and they have a very advanced capability to challenge a traditional army, just like Vietnam. So they have one, but they're being driven back to Syria. So the fact that the Iraqi army, with the assistance of other powers, has driven ISIS slowly back to Syria is a victory, huge victory for Iraqis, and we have to celebrate this. Syria is going to become the isolated war zone in the Middle East, and that's good because you can isolate them, you can defeat them, but the only way we can do this is to make sure that the economies of these countries are back up and running so that these young men and women that are attracted to this ideology are not going to choose that avenue, and they're going to become productive citizens.
We've been speaking with Muqtada Khan. He's a professor at the University of Delaware. Also in our studio, Kevin Arabi. He's American with Iranian ancestry, is also taught at Warwick Community College and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And we thank both of you. We could probably go on for the next hour or two about this, but we have to close it out. I appreciate everybody joining us. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.